What happens when a man who has sworn off love meets the one woman who refuses to thaw his frozen heart? Until she does. The rain hammered against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Alexander Frost. Yes, that was actually his name, and yes, he'd heard every joke, sat motionless in his car, watching the blurred lights of the city melt into watercolor streaks. He'd just left another business dinner where a colleague had tried once again to set him up with someone. A friend of a friend. "She's warm," they'd said. "She'll change you." Alexander had smiled politely, declined, and left before dessert. He didn't want warm. He'd had warm once, and it had burned him alive. 6 years ago, Alexander had been a different man. Open, trusting. Foolish, he would say now. He'd been engaged to a woman named Claire, a woman who laughed like summer and touched him like he was something precious. They'd planned a wedding for spring. She'd chosen peonies. He'd chosen forever. 3 weeks before the ceremony, he came home early from a business trip to surprise her. The surprise was his. She was in their bed with his business partner, wearing the lingerie Alexander had bought her for their honeymoon. That night, something inside him crystallized, hardened, froze over like a lake in December, smooth and impenetrable. He didn't shout. He didn't break things. He simply looked at them both, turned, and walked out. Within a month, he'd dissolved the business partnership, sold the apartment, and rebuilt his life with one fundamental rule. Never again would he let anyone close enough to hurt him. The irony wasn't lost on him that this transformation made him more successful. In the corporate world, coldness reads as confidence. Emotional distance becomes strategic thinking. His inability to be swayed by sentiment made him a feared negotiator. His refusal to engage in office politics made him seem above it all. Within 3 years, he'd built his own consulting firm. Within 5, he was one of the most sought-after strategic advisors in the city. But success has a price, and Alexander paid it in the currency of isolation. His penthouse apartment was immaculate, modern, cold, chrome and glass and sharp angles. No photographs, no clutter. Nothing that suggested a human being actually lived there rather than just existed between business engagements. His routine was precise. Coffee at 6:15, gym at 6:30, office by 8, meetings, calls, strategies, solutions, home by 7. A carefully constructed life that ran like a Swiss watch, every gear in its place, every movement predictable. This was fine. This was safe. This was exactly what he wanted. Until Emma Cole walked into his office on a Tuesday morning in October. She wasn't supposed to be there. His assistant had scheduled a meeting with someone else entirely, but apparently that person had sent their partner instead. Alexander looked up from his laptop, already annoyed at the disruption to his expectations, and there she was. The first thing he noticed was that she was soaked. Drenched, actually. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her face, and her coat, a bright red thing that seemed almost aggressive in its cheerfulness, dripped steadily onto his pristine carpet. She wasn't apologetic about it. She wasn't embarrassed. She just smiled, extended a wet hand, and said, "Emma Cole, sorry about your floor." The cab drove through what I can only describe as a mobile lake. Alexander didn't take her hand. He looked at it, then at her, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit, but perhaps on the mat, not the chair." A different person would have been offended. Emma laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite twitter he was used to in professional settings. "Fair," she said, and instead of sitting, she shrugged off her coat, hung it on the coat rack, still dripping, and somehow produced a small towel from her bag to lay on the chair before sitting down. "You carry a towel?" Alexander asked despite himself. "I carry a lot of things," Emma replied. "Tissues, band-aids, a portable phone charger, safety pins, and yes, a small towel. I like to be prepared, which is ironic because I'm chronically late to everything and frequently lose my keys. But when I'm there, I'm useful. Alexander had no idea what to do with this person. She didn't fit any category he'd created for people. She was professional, but not polished. Prepared, but chaotic. Wet and ridiculous, but somehow completely unbothered by it. He decided to ignore her entirely and focus on work. "You're here about the merger," he said, opening the relevant file on his screen. "Your partner, Adrian, yes. He's got food poisoning from what we're pretty sure was gas station sushi. I know, but he was hungry and optimistic. I'm taking over this project. This is a $60 million merger." "Yes. And you've been briefed?" "Completely. Adrian and I have been working on this together from the start. I know every asset, every liability, every skeleton in every closet. I'm probably more prepared than he is, actually, because I have a weird photographic memory for numbers and he has to double-check everything." Alexander studied her. She met his gaze steadily, no nervousness, no posturing. Just calm confidence. He made a decision. "Fine. Walk me through the due diligence findings." She did. For the next hour, Emma Cole proved that her cheerful chaos was deceiving. She was sharp, incisive. She caught things his own team had missed. She asked questions that made him reconsider assumptions. She had printouts and digital files, and could toggle between high-level strategy and granular detail without missing a beat. Alexander found himself engaged in a way he hadn't been in months. She challenged him. Not aggressively, but intellectually. She made him think. When the meeting ended, Alexander realized two things. First, he'd actually enjoyed the last hour. Second, he didn't want her to leave yet. This was dangerous. "Same time next week?" Emma asked, gathering her things. Her coat was still damp. "Yes," Alexander said. Then, before he could stop himself, "Take a car service. I'll have my assistant arrange it. Bill it to the project." Emma paused, looked at him with something like amusement. "Because I'm wet?" "Because it's practical. This project requires consistency. Can't have key personnel delayed by mobile lakes." "Right, practical." She smiled, and Alexander had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through him. "See you next week, Mr. Frost." After she left, Alexander sat in his office longer than usual. The room felt different somehow. Smaller. The silence that usually comforted him now felt hollow. He noticed the small wet footprints she'd left on his floor, already drying, already disappearing. He told himself this was nothing. One interesting meeting. He'd had those before. This didn't change anything. His walls were still firmly in place. His life was still exactly as he wanted it. But that night, alone in his chrome and glass apartment, Alexander caught himself wondering what Emma's home looked like. Whether it was as chaotically organized as she seemed to be, whether she lived alone or with someone. And then, more disturbingly, he wondered what she thought of him. These were not thoughts he allowed himself to have. He poured a scotch and stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Emma Cole was going about her evening, completely unaware that she'd created the first crack in a wall it had taken 6 years to build. A hairline fracture, barely visible. But fractures have a way of spreading. Retried. The following Tuesday arrived with unsettling clarity. No rain, just crisp autumn air and a sky so blue it seemed artificial. Alexander had told himself all week that his thoughts about Emma were simply professional curiosity. She was competent. He respected competence. That was all. He'd even managed to convince himself this was true until his assistant informed him that Ms. Cole had arrived 10 minutes early and was waiting in the conference room. 10 minutes early. Emma, who had described herself as chronically late, was early. Alexander found her standing at the window, looking out at the city with an expression he couldn't quite read. She'd dressed more formally today, a charcoal suit that somehow still managed to look slightly rebellious, maybe because she'd paired it with deep purple heels that no serious businesswoman should wear. When she turned, she was holding 2 coffee cups. "I brought coffee," she said, offering him one. "Fair trade. You're sending cars for me, I'm bringing caffeine. Although I realize I don't actually know how you take your coffee, so I had to guess." Black seemed like the obvious choice for someone with an all-white office, but that felt too on the nose, so I went with a flat white. Seemed appropriately contradictory. Alexander took the cup, unsure whether to be annoyed or amused. "You psychoanalyze everyone you work with?" "Only the interesting ones." There it was again. That directness. No games, no corporate doublespeak. Just honesty delivered with a slight smile. Alexander sat down, opened his laptop, and tried to remember how to be the cold, efficient consultant everyone expected. The meeting progressed smoothly. They reviewed projections, discussed integration strategies, debated the timeline. But something had shifted. Emma asked him a question about risk assessment, and instead of giving his standard answer, Alexander found himself explaining his actual thought process. The reasoning behind the reasoning. She listened with complete attention, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but actually processing what he said. "That's darker than I expected," she said when he finished. "You really do assume the worst-case scenario in everything. It's called being prepared. It's called being scared." The room went very quiet. Alexander felt his jaw tighten. "Excuse me?" Emma didn't back down. She leaned forward slightly, her expression serious now, almost gentle. "I'm not trying to be rude, but I've been doing this long enough to recognize the difference between healthy caution and defensive armor. You don't plan for worst-case scenarios because you're practical. You plan for them because you're convinced they're inevitable. That's not strategy. That's trauma." Alexander stood up. The movement was abrupt, aggressive even. "This meeting is about the merger, not about me." "You're right. I apologize." Emma held up her hands, backed off immediately. "That was unprofessional. I have a bad habit of saying what I'm thinking." But the damage was done. Or perhaps the gift had been given, depending on how you looked at it. Alexander couldn't settle back into the meeting. His concentration had fractured. Emma had seen something he'd worked very hard to hide, and worse, she'd named it out loud. When the meeting ended 20 minutes later, both of them knew it had ended prematurely. Emma gathered her things slowly, deliberately. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, I think your caution has probably saved your clients millions of dollars. Trauma isn't always bad at its job, but it's exhausting to maintain." Then she was gone, leaving Alexander standing in his conference room, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with the soul. He didn't see her for 2 weeks after that. Adrian had recovered and took over the meetings. Alexander told himself this was better, simpler. He could focus on the work without the distraction of Emma's observations and purple shoes and uncomfortable truths. But he found himself checking the meeting schedule obsessively, wondering if she'd appear. Disappointed when she didn't. On a Thursday evening, working late as usual, Alexander made a decision he would later recognize as pivotal. He looked up Emma Cole online. Not for professional reasons. He already had her credentials and background checks. This was personal curiosity, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. Her LinkedIn was standard. MBA from a good school, 10 years of experience, recommendations that praised her innovative thinking. But there was a link to a personal blog she apparently kept. Alexander hesitated, knowing this crossed a line, then clicked anyway. The blog was called Controlled Chaos, and it was exactly what he should have expected. Emma wrote about everything. Travel experiences where plans had fallen apart beautifully, recipes she'd invented by forgetting key ingredients, observations about human nature disguised as stories about her cat. But one entry from 3 years ago stopped him cold. It was titled, "The Year I Learned to Stay," and it was about her divorce. Alexander read it twice. Emma had been married to someone she described as her perfect match on paper. Stable, successful, organized. Everything she wasn't. They'd balanced each other, everyone said. He'd ground her. She'd lift him. But over time, she wrote, she'd realized he didn't want to lift her chaos. He wanted to eliminate it, organize it away, fix her until she fit properly into his structured life. And she'd tried. God, how she'd tried. She'd become quieter, more careful, more controlled. Until one day she'd looked in the mirror and hadn't recognized herself. "I stayed a year longer than I should have," she wrote, "because I kept thinking if I just changed a little more, it would work." But love isn't supposed to be about shrinking yourself to fit someone else's container. It's supposed to be about finding someone whose chaos complements your own. So I left, and I decided that from then on, I would be aggressively, unapologetically myself. If that meant being alone, fine. Loneliness with yourself intact is better than company that requires you to disappear. Alexander closed his laptop, sat in his dark office. Outside, the city hummed with its evening rhythm, people going home, going out, going somewhere that wasn't work. He thought about Emma's words, not from the blog but from their last meeting. Trauma isn't always bad at its job, but it's exhausting to maintain. Was he exhausted? He'd never allowed himself to ask the question. Exhaustion implied that something needed to change, and change required vulnerability, and vulnerability led to pain. Better to just keep moving, keep working, keep maintaining. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hi, Emma here. Adrian gave me your number, hope that's okay. Random question. Do you play chess?" Alexander stared at the message for a full minute. The professional response would be to not respond, or to respond curtly, maintaining boundaries. Instead, he typed, "Yes. Why?" The reply came quickly. "There's a park near my apartment that has outdoor chess tables. I play there sometimes on weekend mornings. Thought you might like it. Very strategic. Very worst-case scenario planning. Also, it's outside, which you probably need." "How do you know what I need?" "I don't. But I recognize someone who spends too much time in rooms with artificial light. Saturday, 10 a.m., Washington Square Park. No pressure, but I'll be there anyway. I usually play against this retired accountant named Maurice, who talks constantly about his grandchildren and still beats me every time." Alexander didn't respond, didn't commit, just put his phone down and tried to return to work. But the words glowed in his mind like neon. "I'll be there anyway." No manipulation, no expectation, just an invitation with no strings attached. Saturday morning, Alexander woke at his usual 6:15, went to the gym, came home, showered, made coffee, sat at his kitchen counter and told himself he wasn't going. It was inappropriate. She was involved in an active project. This crossed professional boundaries. He had work to do anyway, 100 rational reasons. At 9:45, he was in a cab heading to Washington Square Park. He found her exactly where she'd said she'd be, sitting across from an elderly black man who was indeed talking enthusiastically about someone named Rebecca's violin recital. Emma was losing badly. Alexander could see that immediately. But she was laughing and fully engaged. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater the color of rust, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked younger, freer. She glanced up, saw him, and her face transformed with genuine surprise and pleasure. "You came. I was nearby. I was right nearby this specific park on a Saturday morning." She grinned, moved a pawn, got immediately punished for it by Maurice. "Damn. Okay, Maurice, this is Alexander. Alexander Maurice. Maurice is a retired accountant, chess hustler, and has 7 grandchildren whose accomplishments he will describe in detail. 8 now, Maurice corrected, capturing Emma's bishop. Rebecca had another one. And I'm not a hustler, young lady. I simply appreciate when people recognize skill with modest financial tokens. Checkmate in 4 moves, by the way. Emma studied the board, sighed, tipped over her king. I'm getting worse, not better. Because you play with your heart, not your head, Maurice said, not unkindly. He looked at Alexander. You play? Yes. With your head or your heart? Alexander hesitated. It was a strange question, too intimate for a stranger in a park. But something about the morning, the autumn light, the casual atmosphere, Emma watching him with open curiosity, made him answer honestly. I didn't know those were different things. Maurice chuckled, stood up, gestured to his vacated seat. Teach her. She needs someone who thinks like you do. Then he was gone, off to find another opponent, leaving Alexander and Emma alone at the chess table. They reset the board in silence. As they arranged the pieces, their hands nearly touched twice. Alexander noticed Emma didn't wear rings, noticed the tiny scar on her left thumb, noticed how her sleeve had fallen back to reveal a bracelet made of different colored threads, probably handmade, definitely not matching her carefully curated professional appearance. You don't have to actually play, Emma said quietly. If this is too weird, I just thought... White or black? She smiled. You choose. Alexander took white, made his opening move. Emma responded. They played in comfortable silence for several moves, but it was a different kind of silence than Alexander was used to. Not empty, full, pregnant with things unspoken, but somehow understood. Why did you really invite me? Alexander asked, capturing one of her pawns. Emma took her time responding, studying the board, but perhaps seeing something beyond it. Because I think you're lonely, and I know I am. And sometimes lonely people can help each other, even if it's just for a Saturday morning chess game. She looked up, met his eyes directly. And because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since I made you uncomfortable 2 weeks ago, I wanted to apologize properly, in person, away from offices and mergers and professional masks. Alexander felt something crack wider in his chest, that hairline fracture spreading. You didn't make me uncomfortable. You made me honest. That's worse. Is it? He moved his knight, a defensive play. Honesty requires change. Change requires risk. And risk leads to pain, Emma finished, nodding. I know that equation. I've lived it. She made her move, something unexpected that opened up the center of the board. But here's what I learned. The equation is incomplete. Yes, risk can lead to pain, but no risk. That leads to slow death. The kind where you're still breathing, but you're not actually alive anymore. And that pain is worse because it never ends. It just becomes background noise. Alexander stared at the board, at her move. She'd exposed her queen but created 3 different threatening possibilities. It was chaos with purpose, beautiful and dangerous, and completely unlike how he played. He could punish the exposure or respond to the threats, but he couldn't do both. You're going to lose your queen, he said. Maybe. Or maybe that's what I want you to think. He looked up at her, and something in her expression made his carefully constructed walls feel suddenly paper-thin. Emma wasn't playing chess. Or rather, she was playing chess but also playing something else entirely. Offering something, challenging something. Alexander made his decision. Instead of taking the obvious capture, he made a move that engaged with her chaos. Met it, matched it. Emma's smile was radiant. There you are, she said softly. They played for another hour. Alexander won, but barely. And only because Emma sacrificed her queen in an unexpected gambit that almost worked. When it was over, they sat there, neither moving, the defeated pieces scattered between them like the remnants of walls that had begun to crumble. "Coffee?" Emma asked. Alexander knew what he should say, knew the safe answer, knew that coffee would lead to conversation, conversation would lead to connection, connection would lead to vulnerability. He knew all of this with perfect clarity. "Yes," he said anyway. The coffee shop Emma led him to was nothing like the sleek minimalist cafes Alexander frequented. It was cramped and cluttered with mismatched furniture, walls covered in local art that ranged from brilliant to baffling, and a chalkboard menu written in handwriting so chaotic it looked like a seismograph during an earthquake. The air smelled of cinnamon and old books and something baking that made Alexander's carefully controlled diet seem suddenly pointless. "I know it's not your aesthetic," Emma said, reading his expression as they waited in line. "But they make the best cardamom coffee in the city, and the owner's daughter is trying to launch an art career, so they let her display work here. Sometimes supporting people's chaos is more important than maintaining your own order." Alexander found himself studying a painting near their table, an abstract piece that was either a sunset or an explosion. He couldn't tell which. Maybe both. "You see the world very differently than I do." "I know." Emma stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon making soft sounds against the ceramic. "You see patterns and systems and structures. I see possibilities and connections and potentials. Neither is wrong. They're just different languages. But they're incompatible languages. Are they?" She tilted her head, and Alexander noticed how the light from the window caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "Or have we just been taught they are? Every good system needs chaos to evolve. Every good chaos needs structure to sustain itself. Nature figured this out millions of years ago. Humans are just stubbornly behind." They talked for 2 hours. Not about work, not about the merger, but about everything else. Emma told him about growing up in a family of accountants as the only chaotic element, how she'd felt broken for years because she couldn't be organized the way they were. How she'd finally realized that her brain worked differently, not wrongly. Alexander found himself sharing things he never shared, not about Claire. He wasn't ready for that. But about the pressure of being perfect, of building a reputation on never making mistakes, of how exhausting it was to be the person everyone turned to for certainty in an uncertain world. "You know what's funny?" Emma said as they left the cafe, walking with no particular destination. "People think chaos is easy and order is hard, but it's the opposite. Chaos is terrifying. It requires constant trust that things will work out, even when you can't see the path. Order feels safe, but it's a prison you build for yourself, one routine at a time." Alexander stopped walking. They were on a street corner, afternoon light painting everything golden, people streaming around them like water around stones. "Is that what you think I've done? Built a prison?" Emma looked at him for a long moment, her expression serious. "I think you built a fortress, and fortresses keep things out, but they also keep things in. The question is, what are you protecting, Alexander? And is it worth what you're sacrificing to maintain it?" Before he could answer, his phone rang. Work. Always work. He glanced at the screen, saw it was a client, watched Emma's face carefully not change as she recognized he would take the call. Of course he would take the call. That was who he was. "I should go," Emma said simply. "It's fine. Thank you for chess, and coffee, and for letting me see the person under the consultant for a few hours." She walked away before he could respond, her rust-colored sweater bright against the grey city backdrop, getting smaller and smaller until she turned a corner and disappeared. Alexander stood there with his ringing phone, watching the space where she'd been, feeling something he couldn't name settle heavy in his chest. He took the call, solved the problem, went home. But that night, in his pristine apartment, Alexander did something he hadn't done in 6 years. He looked at old photographs on his laptop, pictures from before Claire, before the betrayal, before the fortress. There was a photo of himself at 25, at a beach bonfire with college friends, laughing at something with his head thrown back, looking unguarded and young and free. Alexander stared at that person like he was looking at a stranger. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Couldn't remember the last time he'd felt anything without analyzing it first, categorizing it, deciding whether it was safe to feel. Emma's words echoed. What are you protecting? And is it worth what you're sacrificing? The weeks that followed felt like living in two different worlds simultaneously. Professionally, Alexander and Emma maintained perfect boundaries. Adrian had returned to the meetings and Emma only appeared occasionally, always prepared, always professional, never referencing their Saturday together. But something had shifted in how they communicated. When Emma caught his eye across the conference table, there was understanding there, recognition. They were keeping secrets together, even if the secret was just that they'd seen each other as humans instead of roles. But privately, they'd started texting. Nothing inappropriate, just small things. Emma would send him a photo of a particularly chaotic piece of street art with the caption, "Controlled chaos" or "Uncontrolled order." Alexander would respond with a picture of his perfectly organized desk and a single pencil placed at a slight angle, captioned, "Living dangerously." It was silly. It was nothing. It was everything. One evening, Emma sent him a link to an article about the psychology of risk assessment with the message, "Thought of you, but in a good way." Alexander read the article twice. It discussed how people who'd experienced betrayal often developed hypervigilant risk assessment as a coping mechanism, constantly scanning for threats, building elaborate protective systems. The article suggested this was initially adaptive, but could become maladaptive if maintained too long, essentially trapping people in a state of permanent defensive posture. He typed and deleted 3 responses before finally sending, "Are you trying to therapize me via text message? Would that work? No. Then I'm just sharing interesting things with someone I think would appreciate them. Also, Maurice wants a rematch. He says you play too safe and he wants to teach you aggression." I know aggression. Controlled aggression isn't real aggression. It's just violence in a suit. Saturday, same time, same place. Alexander looked at his calendar. He had a perfectly good reason to say no. Work to do, always work to do. But what he found himself typing was, yes. This became their pattern. Saturdays at the chess tables. Sometimes Maurice was there, sometimes not. Sometimes they played against each other, sometimes against strangers. And always they talked. Emma asked questions that no one else dared ask. Why did he work so much? What did he actually want from life beyond success? When was the last time he'd done something just because it made him happy? Alexander deflected, redirected, used every technique he'd perfected over years of strategic consulting. But Emma was patient. She didn't push. She just waited present and open until slowly, incrementally, Alexander found himself answering. Not fully, not about Claire, but more than he'd shared with anyone in years. One Saturday in late November, with the first real cold of winter biting at their faces, Alexander arrived to find Emma already at their usual table, but not setting up chess pieces. She was just sitting there, looking at her phone with an expression he'd never seen on her face, defeated, lost. "What's wrong?" She looked up, seemed surprised he could read her so clearly. "Nothing. Everything. My ex-husband is getting remarried. To someone very organized, according to the engagement announcement that 3 different people felt the need to send me. Apparently she's a professional event planner, which is, perfect for him. He finally got his chaos-free life." Alexander sat down across from her, uncertain how to navigate this. Comfort wasn't his strength, but he tried. "You left him. You chose to leave. I know, and I don't want him back. I really don't. It's just..." She paused, struggling for words in a way he'd never seen. It makes me wonder if I'm the problem. If maybe I should have tried harder to be what he needed. If maybe all my talk about being authentically myself is just an excuse for being difficult and scattered and too much. You're not too much. Emma laughed, but it was bitter. You barely know me, Alexander. You've seen me maybe 10 times. You have no idea if I'm too much. I know that in every meeting, you're the smartest person in the room. I know that you catch details others miss precisely because your mind makes unexpected connections. I know that Maurice, who doesn't suffer fools, lights up when he sees you coming. I know that you brought coffee and somehow intuited exactly how I'd take it. I know that you're honest in a world that rewards lying. And I know... He stopped, unsure if he should continue, then did anyway. I know that you make me want to be less careful. Emma went very still. Alexander, you asked me once what I'm protecting. I'm protecting myself from feeling what I'm feeling right now. From caring whether you're sad about your ex-husband's engagement. From wanting to tell you that he was an idiot to try to organize you away instead of celebrating what makes you remarkable. From... He forced himself to stop, to pull back before he said too much. But Emma was looking at him with something raw and real in her expression. From what? The moment hung between them, crystalline and fragile. Alexander felt the weight of 6 years of careful control pressing down. Felt the wall he'd built so meticulously develop not just cracks, but fissures. One honest answer could bring the whole thing down. Safety warred with something deeper, something he'd buried so thoroughly he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist. From hoping, he finally said. The words quiet but devastating in their honesty. From hoping that maybe chaos and order can speak the same language after all. Emma reached across the chess table and did something she'd never done before. She took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the November air, but her grip was steady. I'm scared too, she said. I told myself I was done trying to fit into someone else's structure. And you're all structure, Alexander. You're a walking blueprint of control. Everything about you should send me running. But you're also the only person I've met in 3 years who makes me want to try. Not to change myself, but to see if maybe there's a way to, I don't know, build something together instead of one person fitting into the other person's existing architecture. Alexander looked down at their joined hands. This was the moment, the decision point. He could pull away, make a joke, rebuild the wall. Or he could do the thing that terrified him most. He could let himself fall. I haven't told you why I'm like this, he heard himself say. Why I need so much control. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Because if we're doing this, whatever this is, you should know who you're dealing with. So there, in a public park on a cold November morning, Alexander Frost told someone about Claire for the first time in 6 years. Not the sanitized version he'd implied in business settings when people asked about his personal life. The real version. The humiliation. The betrayal. The way he'd felt his entire foundation crumble in a single moment. The person he'd become in the aftermath. Harder, colder, unreachable. Emma listened without interrupting. Didn't offer platitudes or try to minimize his pain. When he finished, she said something he didn't expect. That must have been devastating, and I understand why you responded by building walls. But Alexander, that was 6 years ago. You've been living in a response to something that's over. You're not protecting yourself from Claire anymore. You're protecting yourself from life itself. And that's not safety. That's just slow suffocation. The words hit like a physical blow. Because she was right. He'd known it somewhere deep down, but hearing it said aloud made it undeniable. He'd built his entire life around avoiding a repeat of one terrible night, and in doing so, he'd eliminated not just the possibility of pain, but the possibility of anything real at all. I don't know how to be different, he admitted, and the vulnerability in his own voice was staggering. Emma squeezed his hand. Maybe you don't have to be different. Maybe you just have to be willing. Willing to try. Willing to risk. Willing to let someone see you without all the armor. And if it ends badly, then it ends badly, and we survive it because we're both survivors. But what if it doesn't, Alexander? What if this time, with different people who've learned from their mistakes, it actually works? They sat there, hands clasped across a chess table, while around them the park moved through its Saturday rhythms. A child screamed with laughter somewhere. A dog barked. A street musician started playing violin, the notes haunting and beautiful and slightly out of tune. Alexander realized he was at a precipice. Behind him was 6 years of careful control, of strategic living, of safety and loneliness intertwined so thoroughly he couldn't separate them. Ahead was uncertainty, risk, the terrifying possibility of hope. I'm going to be terrible at this, he said finally. Emma smiled, and it was like sunrise. At what? At whatever this becomes. I'll want too much control. I'll pull away when I feel vulnerable. I'll plan for worst-case scenarios even in moments that should be spontaneous. I'll probably hurt you without meaning to. Probably. And I'll be too scattered. I'll lose track of time and forget appointments. I'll push you to feel things you're not ready to feel. I'll make jokes when you need seriousness. I'll probably drive you crazy. Definitely. So we'll be terrible at this together. Is that a plan? Alexander laughed, and it shocked him. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind he'd seen in that old photograph of his younger self. That's possibly the worst plan I've ever agreed to. Good thing you're excellent at risk assessment, then. You can tell me all the ways we might fail, and I'll ignore your advice and do it anyway. But even as they joked, even as the moment turned lighter, Alexander felt something monumental shifting inside him. The wall hadn't come down completely. Maybe it never would. But there was a door now, and Emma was standing in it, hand extended, asking him to step through into whatever came next. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Work. Always work. He glanced at it, then deliberately, consciously, turned it off. Emma noticed. Did you just... I did. The fortress has a power outage? The fortress is considering, Alexander said slowly, carefully, that maybe it doesn't need to be quite so fortified. Emma's expression softened into something tender and knowing. That's a start. They played chess until the cold became unbearable, then walked through the city with no destination, just moving together through the afternoon. And somewhere between the park and the moment they finally, reluctantly parted ways, Alexander Frost made a choice. Not to stop being careful, not to abandon structure, but to allow for the possibility that his carefully controlled life might have room for beautiful, terrifying chaos after all. That night he didn't go straight home. Instead, he walked, thought, felt. And when he finally entered his pristine apartment, it looked different somehow. Still organized, still controlled. But now it felt less like a sanctuary and more like what Emma had called it. A prison. Beautiful and safe and utterly, devastatingly empty. He stood at his window, looking out at the city lights, and asked himself a question he'd been avoiding for 6 years. Not whether he could risk his heart again, but whether he could live with himself if he didn't. The merger closed in early December. 3 months of meetings, negotiations, revisions, and final signatures. Alexander and Emma were there for the final walkthrough, along with Adrian and both companies' legal teams. It was professional, efficient, perfect. Everything Alexander had built his reputation on delivering. But when the last signature was placed and champagne was poured in glasses that caught the winter light streaming through the conference room windows, Alexander found himself not thinking about the success or the fee or the next project. He was thinking about how Emma had doodled small stars in the margins of her notes during the meeting, How she caught his eye when one lawyer droned on too long and made the tiniest eye roll that only he saw. How she'd somehow made even this sterile corporate ritual feel human. After the celebration wound down and people dispersed back to their respective offices and lives, Emma lingered. She was reorganizing her bag, a process that seemed to involve removing everything, looking surprised by what she found, and putting it all back in a different chaotic arrangement. "So," she said, not looking at him, "project's done?" "Yes." "Which means professionally, we're no longer entangled?" "Correct." "Which means—" She finally looked up, and there was vulnerability in her face that made his chest tight. "Which means, whatever this is between us either becomes something real, or it was just a nice distraction during a work project." Alexander had prepared for this moment, had run scenarios, had built arguments for why they should walk away now. Clean break, no complications. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. She lived in chaos. He lived in order. She was spontaneous. He was planned. She made decisions with her heart. He made them with spreadsheets. Every logical analysis said this wouldn't work. But standing there in the empty conference room with winter light painting everything in shades of gold, and Emma looking at him with hope and fear mixed in equal measure, Alexander realized that logic had stopped mattering somewhere around their third chess game. "Dinner," he said. "Tonight. A real dinner. Not coffee or chess or meetings disguised as something else. A date, if you want." Emma's smile could have powered the entire city. "I want. But I'm picking the restaurant. Because if I let you pick, we'll end up somewhere with 17 forks and a dress code, and I'll feel like I'm being interviewed for a position rather than getting to know someone She stopped, seemed to reconsider her words. "Someone I really like." Somewhere with 17 forks sounds terrible anyway. Does it? The fortress admits imperfection. The fortress, Alexander said carefully, is learning that sometimes the most strategic choice is the one that makes no sense on paper. They went to a Thai restaurant in Emma's neighborhood that night, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and Christmas lights hung year-round, and a menu that had been photocopied so many times it was barely legible. The food was extraordinary. The conversation was better. They talked about everything and nothing, childhoods and dreams and embarrassing moments, and the strange experience of being adults who still sometimes felt like children pretending. Over pad thai and spring rolls, Emma asked him what he actually wanted from life, not what he thought he should want, but what made him happy in a bone-deep way. Alexander had to think about it, really think. It had been so long since he'd asked himself that question. "I think," he said slowly, "I want to feel like I'm building something rather than just maintaining something. For 6 years, I've been in maintenance mode. Maintaining control, maintaining distance, maintaining the walls. It's exhausting. And it doesn't actually go anywhere. It's just endless preservation of a status quo that isn't even satisfying. And what would building look like? I don't know yet. Maybe that's what scares me most. I've always known the plan, always seen 10 steps ahead. But with you—" He paused, met her eyes across the small table. "With you, I can't see the plan. I can barely see tomorrow. And instead of that feeling terrifying, it feels alive." "Yes." Emma reached across the table, took his hand the way she had in the park. "I can't promise this will work. I can't promise I won't frustrate you, or that you won't frustrate me, or that we won't hit some fundamental incompatibility that ends badly. But I can promise I'll never ask you to be someone you're not. Your structure, your planning, your careful thinking, those aren't flaws, Alexander. They're part of who you are. I don't want to chaos away your order. I just want to see if maybe our different ways of being in the world can coexist. Coexist or complement. Ideally, both." They left the restaurant and walked through Emma's neighborhood, so different from Alexander's. Narrow streets with brownstones, small shops still open despite the late hour, people sitting on stoops despite the December cold. It was messy and lived in and somehow more real than the pristine blocks where Alexander's building stood like a glass monument to successful isolation. "Do you want to see something?" Emma asked, then didn't wait for his answer. She led him down a side street to a community garden tucked between buildings. Even in winter, with most plants dormant, there was beauty there. Someone had hung lanterns in the trees. There were benches made from reclaimed wood, a small fountain covered for the season. "I come here when I need to remember that growth requires both chaos and structure," Emma said, sitting on one of the benches. Alexander sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Look at how gardens work. There's planning, right? Someone decided what goes where, created paths, built supports for plants that need them. But then nature does its thing. Seeds scatter randomly. Plants grow in unexpected directions. What was carefully planned becomes something wild and uncontrolled. And somehow that combination, the human structure and the natural chaos, creates something more beautiful than either could achieve alone." Alexander looked at the sleeping garden, understanding the metaphor but also just appreciating the peace of the space. "You think we're a garden? I think we could be, if we're both willing to do the hard work. You provide structure I need. I provide spontaneity you need. And we see what grows. What if what grows is weeds? Then we pull them and try again. That's how gardens work, Alexander. You don't plant once and walk away. You tend. You adjust. You learn." They sat there in the quiet, in the cold, and Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of his engagement to Claire, built on fantasies of perfection. This was different, more grounded, more real. Hope that acknowledged difficulty but chose to try anyway. In the weeks that followed, they learned each other's rhythms. Emma came to Alexander's apartment and didn't make fun of how organized it was, but she did leave small traces of herself. A colorful scarf on his minimalist coat rack, a book on his coffee table, a mug in his kitchen that didn't match anything else he owned. Alexander went to Emma's place and didn't try to organize her comfortable chaos, but he did quietly fix a loose cabinet door and program her coffee maker so she could wake up to fresh coffee without having to figure out the timing. They had their first fight on New Year's Eve. Emma had planned a spontaneous trip to a cabin upstate without telling Alexander until 2 days before, assuming he'd be free. Alexander, who had his entire January already scheduled, felt ambushed and controlled, which triggered old wounds about Claire making decisions without him. Emma felt like he was trying to calendarize spontaneity out of existence. They argued in Emma's apartment while she packed, both saying things that were true but hurtful. "You can't just expect me to drop everything," Alexander said, frustration sharp in his voice. "I have commitments, responsibilities." "And you can't expect everything to be planned weeks in advance," Emma shot back. "Sometimes good things happen spontaneously. Sometimes you have to just trust and jump." "I don't jump, Emma. I assess and plan and then move strategically." "Then maybe we're too different. Maybe this was a mistake." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. This was the moment, the test. Alexander could walk out, prove that his instincts about protecting himself were correct, end it before it got messier. Instead, he sat down on her chaotic couch and said something that cost him everything. "I'm scared. That's what this is really about. You're asking me to trust. And trust is the thing I broke 6 years ago and haven't fixed. It's not about the cabin or the schedule. It's about me being terrified that if I let go of control, everything will fall apart the way it did before." Emma stopped packing, sat down beside him, was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I'm scared too. My ex wanted to organize me into something manageable, and I'm terrified you're going to try to do the same thing. Every time you suggest a plan or point out something I've forgotten, part of me wonders if you're trying to fix me instead of accept me. I don't want to fix you. I don't want to force you to trust before you're ready." They looked at each other, Both vulnerable, both afraid, both realizing they were fighting the ghosts of past relationships rather than each other. Alexander reached for her hand. "What if we compromise? I come to the cabin, but we plan the next spontaneous thing together, so I have some preparation time. And you tell me when my planning starts to feel like control, and I'll tell you when your spontaneity starts to feel like chaos I can't navigate." Communication like adults. Radical concept. Terrifying concept, but probably necessary. They went to the cabin. It was imperfect. The heat barely worked. The mattress was lumpy, and Alexander's carefully packed bag seemed ridiculous compared to Emma's thrown-together duffel. But they played cards by a fire that Emma insisted on building despite having no real idea how, which Alexander supervised with gentle suggestions that made her laugh. They cooked meals that combined Emma's creative improvisation with Alexander's precise measurements. They took a hike where Emma led them off-trail to a frozen waterfall she'd heard about, and Alexander mapped the route so they could find their way back. On New Year's Eve, they sat on the cabin's small porch wrapped in blankets, watching their breath make clouds in the frozen air. Emma had found champagne somehow. Alexander had brought proper glasses. They toasted to midnight and new beginnings and the strange, unlikely fact of them. "You know what I realized?" Emma said, leaning against his shoulder. "We're not trying to change each other, we're trying to expand each other. You're teaching me that some structure creates freedom rather than limiting it. I'm teaching you that some chaos creates possibility rather than destroying safety. We're both becoming bigger versions of ourselves." Alexander thought about this, about the man he'd been 6 years ago, open but naive. The man he'd become, protected but imprisoned. And the man he was becoming now, with Emma beside him. Still careful but also brave, still strategic, but also spontaneous. Neither his old self nor his defended self, but something new entirely. "I never thought I'd thank Claire for what she did," he said quietly. "But if she hadn't broken me, I wouldn't have built the walls. And if I hadn't built the walls, I wouldn't have needed someone brave enough to find the door. I wouldn't have found you. Pain and growth are often the same thing wearing different clothes," Emma said. "Doesn't make the pain less real, but maybe it makes it mean something." They stayed at the cabin through New Year's Day, then drove back to the city. When Alexander dropped Emma at her apartment, she kissed him goodbye and said something he didn't expect. "I love you. I know it's early and probably too soon to say it, and you don't have to say it back. But I wanted you to know. You make me want to be braver, and loving you feels like the bravest thing I've done." Alexander sat in his car after she went inside, those 3 words echoing in his head. 3 words he'd sworn he'd never say again. 3 words that had preceded the worst pain of his life. 3 words that now felt less like a threat and more like a gift. He got out of the car, went back to her door. When she answered, surprised, he said it. "I love you too, and that terrifies me. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you." Months passed, then a year. They learned each other's languages. Alexander taught Emma systems that didn't constrain but supported. Emma taught Alexander spontaneity that didn't threaten but enlivened. They moved in together, to a new apartment that was neither his sterile minimalism nor her comfortable chaos, but something in between. Clean lines with splashes of color, organization with room for spontaneity, a home that reflected both of them. Morris still beat them at chess every Saturday, though Alexander was getting better at aggressive play and Emma was learning patience. They still had fights, still struggled with their fundamental differences, still had moments where old fears resurfaced. But they'd learned that love wasn't about finding someone who never triggered your wounds. It was about finding someone worth doing the hard work of healing with. One evening in spring, sitting in their apartment with windows open to let in the sound of rain, Emma's influence, and spreadsheets organized on Alexander's laptop, his influence, Emma asked him something. Do you ever miss it? The fortress? The certainty of controlled isolation? Alexander thought about this honestly. Sometimes. When things feel uncertain or scary, there's a part of me that wants to retreat to what felt safe. But then I remember that safety wasn't real. It was just the absence of risk, and absence isn't the same as presence. This, he gestured between them, at their shared space, their shared life. This is scary sometimes, but it's real, and real is better than safe. Even when real is hard. Especially when real is hard. Because hard means it matters. Emma smiled, that sunrise smile that still made his carefully controlled heart do chaotic things. The Ice King melted. No, Alexander said, pulling her close. The Ice King learned that ice and fire aren't opposites. They're just different forms of the same thing: intensity, passion, the courage to feel fully. I didn't melt, I transformed. Outside, the rain continued its rhythm against the windows, chaotic and beautiful and impossible to control. Inside, two people who'd learned different languages were creating a third one together, a dialect of compromise and growth, and the kind of love that doesn't demand change but invites evolution. He wanted a cold wife, the story began. But she didn't make him cold. She didn't make him warm. She made him whole. And sometimes wholeness requires both the structure that holds us together and the chaos that reminds us we're alive. Sometimes the most strategic move is the one that makes no sense on paper, but perfect sense in the heart. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very prisons we need to escape. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we find someone willing to hold the door open while we learn to walk through it, into whatever beautiful, terrifying, imperfect thing comes next.